of course, what's happening around the Thabo Bester case is fascinating in itself. And let's deal with what happened in court today. Dr. Nandipa Magudumana has failed in her bid to overturn her arrest and deportation from Tanzania. She was, of course, apprehended in April while on the run with escaped Facebook rapist and murderer Thabo Bester. Bester escaped from his prison cell in May last year by faking his own suicide in a fire. Let's unpack in more detail today's findings relating to Dr. Magudumana. And I'm joined now by Gary Eisenberg, a specialist immigration and extradition expert. Mr. Eisenberg, thank you so much for your time. So Philip Loacher, the judge today, he actually agreed with Magudumana's lawyers that she'd actually been extradited rather than deported. Deported is what you do to someone who's illegally in a country. That's my understanding anyway. But he still ultimately denied her application to have the whole process declared unlawful. Do you agree, first of all, that this was actually an extradition rather than a deportation?
Well, it was an extradition by necessity, but the due process of an extradition was not followed. And the judge was with Dr. Nandipa as far as that was concerned. He said that the court was in association with all those authorities which supported that claim, that it was in fact a disguised extradition. And the exception to that, the one exception that Judge Loacher found to exist, was that Dr. Nandipa actually consented to her surrender, call it that, to South Africa. And given her consent, the fact that it might have been a disguised extradition in law does not disqualify the magistrate's court from exercising criminal jurisdiction over her. That was his conclusion.
All right. So it's because she said, look, I want to go home, and she wanted to see her children. That's what we hear anyway. What is the difference then in law between a deportation, an extradition and a rendition? Because rendition is something that the Home Affairs Minister spoke about. And I'll quote, he said, the Tanzanians called us because they said they are prohibited in Tanzania. They'll never hand over someone to the police or the army because that will be tantamount to a rendition. They can only hand them over to immigration officers.
I don't think there's very much merit in that at all. Tanzanian state authorities apprehended her at the behest of South Africa or independently. But there is plenty of evidence, if one reads the affidavits of all the parties that were filed in the case, that there was collusion between the Tanzanian government and the South African authorities at various levels, Home Affairs, Police, National Prosecuting Authority, and so on. And that was, call it a rendition, call it a illegal surrender, call it a disguised extradition, whatever you might, it wasn't, due process wasn't followed, especially in light of the fact that the parties had an opportunity of doing the right thing and utilizing the mechanism in place. Tanzania has domestic extradition legislation, so does South Africa, and there's an SADC protocol extradition agreement in place. And the parties colluded to avoid that. Now, I think the court was certainly expressly in agreement with those submissions of Dr. Nandipa, but found that she expressed to one and all and sundry, that she wanted to come home to her children. And that, for the judge, constituted sufficient consent to render this entire process lawful and effective.
So given what you're saying there, and we know that she's planning to appeal today's decision, does she have any hope of success? Because it seems that she scored a bit of an own goal by saying, yes, take me home. Well,
does that constitute consent as a fully informed consent? And that was canvassed in the Mohammed case in 2001, when the Constitutional Court was not satisfied that he actually gave his consent. And I understand that was with the sword of Damocles of a death penalty hanging over his head in the United States. But the consent to be enforceable must be informed. And if it is only on the version of the police affidavit, for example, in this case, that these are her utterances, the big issue here is whether those utterances did constitute an informed consent to be brought over to South Africa. And I think if there is going to be an appeal, and you say that her attorneys have confirmed that there will be, that's going to be a glaring issue in the appeal.
All right, so that's likely to be where they're going to focus their energies. What is the ultimate game plan here, though? Let's say that on appeal, she manages to win this case, with the argument, I was pretty much forced to consent, etc., as you just explained. What would happen? Would she then just go back to Tanzania and then a full extradition process begins? I mean, what is the game plan, do you think?
Well, I don't think there's a game plan. The whole objective of going to the High Court to on review and to disqualify effectively the magistrate's court from exercising criminal jurisdiction over her, not trying her on the charges that were pending against her, that are pending against her. If she prevails in a higher court, then you're going to have an overturning, a vacation of the of Judge Lopes's order, and she's going to be liberated and walk free. And that has been the entire purpose of litigating this in the first instance.
Why do you think the authorities went for a deportation or a sort of a, cutting corners in the extradition process rather than following the extradition process, do you think?
It's really difficult to know from my vantage point, but I understand that South Africa, and I know the Minister of Home Affairs regularly, beats the drum of South Africa's sovereignty. That's been tested again and again, especially with, cross-border mischief. Prophet Bushiri having disappeared over the border without anybody detecting his movements is just one example. But our Minister of Home Affairs is absolutely pressed with his border management legislation up and running to protect the sovereignty of our borders and to protect the sovereignty of this country. And I think this is why they went to such lengths to join the litigation, sending a plane. This was a Home Affairs pursuit, sending a private jet to collect her, having her handed over to immigration official in Tanzania. This is a question of sovereignty. And I think this vindicates that kind of claim and that kind of endeavor. But again, if a higher court overturns Judge Lopes's decision today, I think we're going to have a lot of noses out of joint, state noses out of joint, because sovereignty is now a tremendously important political issue.
Yeah, and of course we've seen, this was seen as a real coup for South Africa to get Bester and her back into this country to face the music. And we've been, as you've mentioned the Bushiri case, and of course the Guptas, we failed there as well. So, it would be a really big deal if this does get overturned on appeal. Thank you so much for chatting to us this evening, Gary Eisenberg. He's a specialist immigration and extradition expert.